Welcome back to the world of Eichard, where we learn how to think like the College Board. Today we're finishing up Unit 5 with topics 5.8 and 5.9.
We'll do 5.9 first and then 5.8. Trust me, it just makes more sense that way. In Unit 4, we looked at changing social hierarchies in 1450 to 1750. Now we've got another set of new classes. Let's start with the middle class. The middle class, also known as the bourgeoisie, were the big winners of the Industrial Revolution. There was a wide range of people in this class. At the top were the captains of industry, owners of factories, banks, and corporations. Although in places like Britain their social status was technically lower than the nobility, they often became more wealthy. And as liberal changes were made to government, they also exercised a great deal of political power. American industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller were some of the richest men in the world, and made landowning European aristocrats seem poor by comparison. Even within Europe, the richest members of the middle class began to eclipse the aristocrats in terms of wealth and power. Further down in the ranks of the middle class were lawyers, bankers, clerks, merchants, teachers, and other sorts of jobs that came to be known as white collar. These jobs generally required a certain degree of literacy, education, and skill. It was the middle class that benefited the most from consumer goods and saw the greatest increase in their political representation. The other new class was the industrial working class. Before the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of people were poor farmers. But as agricultural innovations reduced the need for farm labor, they moved to cities, where they worked in factories, or they worked in mines, gathering the coal and iron needed to fuel industrial capitalism. Some had also been artisans, who in previous times made handmade products like clothes and shoes. But they too had been rendered obsolete by industrial mass production. Generally speaking, the people in the industrial working class had a bad time. The factory system meant that labor was increasingly unskilled. It often involved repetitive tasks that required little training. This meant that workers were easily replaced. And because of the large pools of labor available due to urbanization, there was a lot of competition for jobs, which meant very low wages. Working conditions were also terrible. People worked long hours, often 12 to 14 hours a day or more, to earn just barely enough money to stay alive. Safety conditions were poor, and it was common for people to die or lose limbs in factory machines. Mines were arguably even worse. People worked deep underground in tight spaces, which often collapsed. Those who did not die in these cave-ins often got black lung from prolonged breathing of particulates, and it was often illegal to protest these conditions. Laws existed to protect the private property of the factory owners, but initially no laws existed to protect the rights of the workers. Which takes us to this section here. Workers in the industrial working class included many women. Factory owners, especially in the textile industry, often preferred hiring women because they didn't have to pay them as much, often about half of what men were paid. They also were used in mines since they were generally smaller than men and could fit into more cramped spaces. But the cheapest and smallest workers were children. They could fit into places that adults could not, and their small fingers were often useful for certain small machine parts. These children did not have access to education and often had very short life expectancies. In addition to new social classes, the Industrial Revolution upended the previous social order in other ways as well. One major impact you need to know is about gender roles, but these too depended on social class. For both the middle and working classes, work and home life became increasingly separate. In previous eras, people who were farmers or even artisans did a lot of their work at home, and family members often worked alongside each other. But in the industrial era, people needed to go to work, whether in factories, mines, or offices. For the working class, this often meant men, women, and children, as we already mentioned. But for the middle class, the idea was of separate spheres, with men going out into public life and women staying at home, raising children or doing housework. Barbara Welter describes this development as the cult of domesticity and identified four virtues: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. The financial ability for middle-class women to stay at home was considered a privilege. However, this clearly added social restrictions on their behavior. Working-class women, by contrast, had more freedom to go out and work 14-hour days in the mines and factories, although they might not have considered that to be a privilege. Middle-class children had growing access to education and generally benefited from industrialization. Although for middle-class girls, much of that education was about how to be submissive to their future husbands. Working-class boys and girls did not have the same opportunities. The last part of 5.9 is about other problems related to urbanization. Let's start with pollution. London was an especially filthy city in the early to mid-19th century. One major source of pollution was the factories, which constantly were burning coal. Poor sanitation was also a major source of pollution. Cities like London, Paris, and New York were not designed to deal with the rapid pace of population growth, and human waste was often thrown into the street or nearby rivers. The River Thames in London was especially vile, leading to the Great Stink of 18 1858. Poor sanitation and overcrowding also led to the spread of disease. Poor water quality led to numerous cholera outbreaks in industrialized cities. People lived in crowded structures called tenements, often with multiple families sharing a single bathroom. These buildings were also often structurally unsafe, prone to collapse, and easily burned. Overcrowding and poor ventilation facilitated the spread of tuberculosis and other airborne diseases. In addition to disease and poverty, the neighborhoods of the working class also tended to be hotbeds of crime. London's poor Whitechapel district became infamous with the Jack the Ripper killings. U.S. cities like New York and Chicago had numerous gangs and criminal organizations. Clearly, for many people, industrialization and capitalism had many negative consequences. Now we'll go back to 5.8, which is mostly about ways that people sought to address these issues. Let's start with the workers, who used a variety of measures to resist their terrible conditions and sought ways to improve their situation. One way they did so was by forming labor unions, organizations that work for collective action on behalf of the workers. In the laissez-faire capitalist system, individual workers could be fired or replaced easily, giving them very little power. But collectively, the workers could be much more powerful since they supplied the labor. If the entire labor pool of certain industries refused to work, called going on strike, then the factory owners would have to give them something to come back. Labor unions also became a powerful political force and successfully pressured governments to pass laws in favor of the working class. Here are some examples of labor unions and their goals in this time period. In the United States, the Knights of Labor fought for an 8-hour workday, which eventually became standard practice. It also fought for the elimination of child labor. In Britain, the Trade Union Congress was able to pressure Parliament to make it legal for workers to peacefully go on strike. The International Working Men's Association was in multiple European countries and supported causes to limit working hours, improve factory conditions, and promote greater representation of the working class. Karl Marx was a leading figure of this organization. We'll talk more about him in just a moment. Workers also organized into political parties. For example, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, the French Workers' Party, and the British Labour Party. Members of these parties gained seats in parliaments and other elected posts in government, where they directly influenced the passing of pro-worker laws and reforms. The next section is about various ideologies promoted by those who were critical of capitalism and wanted alternatives. Socialism is kind of an umbrella term that applies to various ideologies. Generally, socialists prefer more state involvement in the economy, greater equality in the distribution of money and resources, and state-provided services like education, medical care, and insurance. Robert Owen was an important early figure in what came to be called utopian socialism. Owen was a textile factory owner himself and experimented with alternative ways of running his business. His workers had shorter working days and were provided education and housing for their families. The utopian socialists believed that industrialization provided enough abundance for everyone, and that an ideal society would share this more evenly. Another ideology was utilitarianism, associated mostly with John Stuart Mill. The idea was to achieve utility, meaning the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Utilitarians did not have a fixed ideology, nor did they seek to overthrow capitalism, but they advocated for policies that addressed the severe unhappiness of the poor. Finally, there is Karl Marx and communism, arguably the most radical of the major alternative ideologies. In addition to political philosophy, Karl Marx studied and wrote about history, where he remains very influential. Anytime that we talk about social classes in AP World History, you could say that we're studying history through a Marxist lens. To Marx, history was all about class struggle. The French Revolution, which happened a couple generations before, was an example of the triumph of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, over the feudal system dominated by the aristocrats. As a result of industrialization, the middle class bourgeoisie had become the new dominant class, enriching themselves at the expense of the proletariat. The proletariat was the lower class, which included the industrial workers and the farmers. In his book, The Communist Manifesto, Marx predicted that the next phase of history would be the rise of the proletariat. They would seize the means of production. Factory workers would take over the factories, and peasant farmers would take over the farms. The bourgeoisie and landowning aristocrats would be eliminated. The goal was a classless society, with collective ownership and the end of private property. Although this did not go exactly as Marx predicted in most industrial states, his ideas became very influential. Communist parties were created in multiple countries, who contributed to the growing political power of the working class. His rallying cry, "Workers of the world unite," spurred many workers' movements, and in the 20th century led to many successful communist revolutions around the world. But we'll need to wait for Units 7 and 8 for that. More common than worker-led revolutions were incremental reforms that happened over the course of the 19th and early 20th century that addressed some of the most severe problems of industrial capitalism. Britain's Factory Act of 1833 restricted the use of child labor, and similar acts in 1844 and and 1847 went further and limited working hours for most people to 10 hours per day. Children increasingly became viewed less as potential workers and more as potential students. The ideal of universal education for all children was becoming more widespread. In the United States, Horace Mann and others associated with the Common School movement advocated for more standardized education available to all children. In France, Jules Ferry and others successfully legislated free education for all boys and girls in 1881. Governments also passed laws to improve the terrible living conditions in urban centers. Improvements in sanitation, such as construction of sewers and drainage systems, helped to remove human waste and reduce the spread of diseases like cholera. Baron Haussmann's grand renovation of Paris included the dismantling of narrow medieval-era streets and the creation of grand boulevards, which improved the flow of traffic, provided gutters and sewers for sanitation, and also improved access to light. New York City passed similar reforms, improving sanitation as well as the living conditions of the tenements where the working poor lived. Governments also passed laws that provided financial assistance to people directly. For example, the conservative chancellor Otto von Bismarck in Germany famously created the first national health insurance program in 1883, which required employers and employees to provide funds that could be distributed to people for sick pay and medical expenses.
Why would a conservative politician create the first socialized healthcare system?
A great question. Actually, Bismarck, like many conservative and liberal politicians, feared the growing influence of socialism and communism. So governments passed laws granting limited social benefits to appease the demands of the working classes and avoid full-scale revolution. The last section today is about the attempts of the Ottoman Empire and Qing dynasty to reform and modernize their economies and militaries, which were often resisted by some members of government or established elite groups. Let's start with the Ottomans, who enacted a series of reforms collectively known as Tanzimat. In our video about nationalism, we mentioned some of these military reforms and how they were resisted by groups such as the Janissaries, who felt threatened by the changes to their elite status. There were also numerous economic reforms. For example, tax farming was abolished and more standardized taxation was enacted. The nation was connected through its first railroads and telegraph lines. Land ownership was also modernized based on the prevailing ideas of individual private property. In addition to the Janissaries, the Muslim religious elites, the ulama, resisted many reforms because they went against Islamic traditions. Also, traditional merchants and guilds resisted the modernizing economic reforms which threatened their own privileged status. One lasting successful institution from Tanzimat was the creation of the Ottoman Bank, but this was financed and operated by the British and French. Finally, we have the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, who had the self-strengthening movement, which began in the 1860s. As a result of disastrous defeats in the Opium Wars, where the British and French burned down the Forbidden City, and the ongoing Taiping Rebellion, which killed tens of millions of people, the Qing dynasty looked to be on the brink of collapse. Over the next few decades, it enacted reforms to modernize the economy and the military. Just like with the Ottoman Empire, there was resistance from established elites, such as the Confucian bureaucrats who tended to be conservative and suspicious of changes. But there were some notable successes. For example, as with the Ottomans, the construction of substantial railways and telegraph lines, modern steam-powered ships, and a reorganization of the military, equipped with Western weapons. The Qing's new modernized military still proved to be no match for the much smaller but much more industrialized military of Japan, which decisively won the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. This defeat sparked yet another reform movement, the 100 Days of Reform, which, as you can probably guess from the name, didn't last long enough to cause much of an impact.
That's all for today, and we're finally done with Unit 5. We'll see you next time for Unit 6. Until then, keep thinking like the College Board.